Elizabeth Bennet, Wit, Will and Quiet Revolution. Well, we finally made it. The final chapter in the series, and what a character she is. From the moment Elizabeth Bennet walks into the narrative with a raised brow and a defiant smile, we know we're dealing with someone different. She's clever, she's confident, and she doesn't mince her words, which, in a world that expects women to stay politely silent, makes her quite a quiet kind of revolutionary.
In politic, too, for it provokes me to retaliate and say somewhat of his behaviour in Hertfordshire which may shock his relations.
Readers love her for her intelligence, her spirit, and her ability to hold her own in a room full of men who expect silence. But there is more to Elizabeth than charm and cheer. Beneath the sharp tongue and sparkling eyes lies a character shaped by constraint, by social expectation, and by deepening self-awareness. In this final instalment of my Pride and Prejudice character analysis series, we're turning our gaze to the woman at the heart of it all. But I don't just want to rehash what makes Lizzie so beloved. I want to go deeper, because beneath the wit and the walking tours, there's something far more interesting happening. A story of a woman shaped by family dysfunction, social pressures, and her own evolving insight. Elizabeth, too, is written with the same quiet deliberateness that Austen employs with all her characters. She's not simply clever or charming or a feminist before her time. She's a woman driven by principle, humbled by error, and transformed by love. Austen doesn't present her heroine as flawless. Instead, Elizabeth's journey is meant to unfold with us, layer by layer, as Austen gently reveals the quiet revolutions that make her not just admirable, but unforgettable. And if we look closely enough, we may even see a reflection of Jane Austen herself. We meet Elizabeth and think we know her immediately. She's clever, she's observant, she's got a wicked sense of humour, and she isn't afraid to use it.
I was surprised to see Darcy in town last month. Wonder what he could be doing there.
Perhaps preparing for the wedding.
Her verbal sparring with Darcy is legendary. Her refusal to flatter Mr. Collins is delightful, and her loyalty to Jane is touching. She becomes our compass, charming, confident, and perceptive. And we, like the characters in her world, are drawn to her. But Austen, always the master of narrative sleight of hand, lets us admire Elizabeth more gently, unravelling the myth of her infallibility. What begins as admiration slowly evolves into introspection for Elizabeth and for the reader. Elizabeth isn't always right. In fact, her greatest flaw is perhaps that she believes she is. Her confidence in her insight often blinds her to the truth. She judges people quickly. For instance, she judges Darcy too harshly and Wickham too generously. She assumes Bingley's reticence towards Jane is deliberate cruelty, and she possibly misreads Charlotte's pragmatism as betrayal, although she does come around to acceptance on that score quite quickly.
I was surprised. But Charlotte, if Mr. Collins has been so fortunate as to secure your affections, I'm delighted for you both.
She's therefore so sure of her perspective that she overlooks what lies beneath the surface. And yet, Austen doesn't punish her for these mistakes. She allows Elizabeth to misstep with a rare grace, showing that growth doesn't come from perfection, it comes from reckoning. Elizabeth's journey isn't a fall from brilliance, but a deepening of it. What's particularly compelling is that Elizabeth doesn't learn her lessons all at once. Her misjudgments are cumulative, and we experience them alongside her. Austen, like the careful teacher, begins to unspool her confidence thread by thread. The genius of Austen is that she doesn't humiliate Elizabeth, she humanizes her. She lets her be wrong with dignity and then lets her grow, not away from her sharpness, but through it. Elizabeth's wit is one of the most admired aspects of her character. It's her shield and her sword, a way of navigating the world with elegance and bite. She uses language like a blade, deflecting absurdity, exposing hypocrisy, and entertaining her companions and readers alike.
Lady Catherine de Bourgh herself was kind enough to suggest that these shelves be fitted exactly as you see them.
Shelves in the closet. Happy thought indeed.
In a society that often prized silence and subservience in women, Elizabeth's cleverness is an act of subtle rebellion. But wit, for Elizabeth, is almost a kind of armour. When she is embarrassed, uncertain, or emotionally vulnerable, she retreats into irony. It's not cruelty, but self-preservation. She doesn't wound others, she protects herself. Her sarcasm isn't vanity, but a buffer against the discomfort of feeling deeply. We see this most clearly after Darcy's first proposal. Her reaction isn't laughter, but outrage. And yet there's something fragile in it. She is stunned, not only by his presumption, but by her own reaction. And later, when she reads his letter, arguably the turning point in the novel, her response in the original text is remarkably internal. Austen offers no spoken lines, no sharp comment, no clever deflection, just thought, reflection, humility. In contrast, the BBC 95 adaptation makes a different artistic choice. Elizabeth, as we know, played by Jennifer Ely, reads the letter aloud, reflecting in real time with lines like,
Really astonished me.
these spoken thoughts are not in the novel, but they cleverly dramatise the processing of her emotions for the visual medium. In Austen's original, however, the transformation is silent and solitary. Elizabeth's wit gives way to a dawning self-awareness that requires no audience. Austen writes, she grew absolutely ashamed of herself. Of neither Darcy nor Wickham could she think without feeling she had been blind, partial, prejudiced, absurd. It's a moment of deep internal reckoning, conveying not through dialogue, but through reflection, demonstrating the emotional honesty Austen trusted her readers to perceive. That silence in the text is where Elizabeth's transformation truly begins. It marks the first time she listens without planning a retort, processing without passing judgment. It's a moment of internal stillness, and in that stillness she begins to change. Austen's genius is in showing that someone like Elizabeth, who lives by her words, silence can be the most profound declaration of all. Before Darcy's letter shatters her assumptions, Elizabeth is thoroughly charmed by Mr. Wickham. Handsome, affable, and apparently wronged, Wickham appears to be the very opposite of Darcy.
I'm afraid I've not been invited by Mr. and Mrs. Phillips.
Oh, no one cares about that sort of thing nowadays.
But if Mrs. Phillips extended the invitation to include me, I should be delighted.
Open, approachable, and warm, Elizabeth engages with him eagerly, amused by his manners and receptive to his attentions. Even Mr. Bennet, in his usual sardonic fashion, jokes that Elizabeth might make a fine match with Wickham, but his full comment, steeped in irony, cuts deeper than it first appears.
Let Wickham be your man. He's a pleasant fellow. He joked you creditably.
It isn't a true endorsement, but a mock approval of Wickham's charm, a nod to how convincingly he plays the gentleman despite his lack of substance. Mr. Bennet, who so often retreats into cynicism, sees through Wickham more clearly than he lets on.
Very good of him to entertain us so eloquently with stories about his misfortunes.
His remark mocks both the superficiality of social courtship and reflects his detached amusement, even at the potential emotional cost of his daughter.
With such narratives to hand, who would read novels?
But I believe he has truly been treated contemptibly by Mr. Darcy, Father.
And it shocks Elizabeth. At this stage in the narrative, she is full of admiration for Wickham, and her father's comment, however jokingly made, jars against the perception she's so readily embraced. This moment subtly exposes a blind spot in Elizabeth's judgment, revealing how easily she, like many others, can be swayed by charm and a compelling story. Her reaction, though not dramatic, contributes to the broader arc of her growth. It reveals her naivety, her trust in appearance, and her susceptibility to bias, elements of her character that Austen will challenge, confront, and refine as the story progresses. This early attraction reinforces a key flaw in Elizabeth's character, her insight. Though sharp, is often guided by bias. She trusts Wickham not because of his proven virtue, but because he conveniently supports her existing dislike for Darcy. This isn't ignorance, but a subtle form of self-deception, a desire to confirm that what she already believes. Her confidence and judgment, which is so fundamental to her character, is precisely what leads her astray.
Have you known Mr. Darcy long?
About a month.
I've known him all my life. We played together as children.
This moment is part of a broader theme of Pride and Prejudice, where intellect, untested by experience, can easily become a barrier to truth. What makes this particularly important is the social realism Austen injects into it. Elizabeth isn't naive because she's romantic. She's naive because, like many young women in her position, she must rely on impressions, appearances, and reputation. She has no access to Wickham's past, no way to fact-check his story. In this light, her mistake isn't foolish, but a poignant reminder of how vulnerable women were to men who could manipulate both manners and truth.
I could more easily imagine Mr. Bingley being opposed upon than to think that Mr. Wickham could invent such a history.
Moreover, Elizabeth's reaction to Wickham also reveals something she desires: ease, charm, and the ability to be seen. Wickham pays attention to her, flatters her, and lets her be playful. He makes her feel clever and admired. That Darcy eventually earns this role, without flattery, without performance, is what makes her shift in affection all the more powerful. This phase of her arc reveals that even the most self-possessed characters can be misled by charm and first impressions, and that Elizabeth's growth begins not with knowledge, but with the humility to accept that she has been wrong. Perhaps one of Elizabeth's most defining traits is her refusal to marry without love. In turning down both Mr. Collins and, initially, Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth risks not only the social ridicule but financial insecurity, and she does so without hesitation. Her stance isn't dramatic, it's deliberate. She doesn't believe in marrying for advantage or obligation. For Elizabeth, love must be founded on respect, compatibility, and a true meeting of minds. This decision feels modern, even revolutionary, but is it also personal? Jane Austen herself was once briefly engaged, a union she ended after just one night. She too chose autonomy over comfort, and she, like Elizabeth, up to this point in the story, remained unmarried. There is no record of Austen regretting her decision. Instead, she created characters who walk the same quiet line between personal conviction and social expectation. Austen herself had her own flirtations and fascinations. Tom Lefroy was often cited as the real-life inspiration for Darcy, a young man Jane met, briefly loved, but could not marry. One wonders, is Elizabeth a version of Jane who could say yes, who did get the man she loved? Is Pride and Prejudice just a novel, or is it perhaps a quiet wish? When Elizabeth imagines becoming a governess in Jane and Bingley's home, should she never marry, we feel Austen's voice behind the page, not bitter, but resolute. Marriage for convenience is no marriage at all. Love must be real, or not at all.
If I could love a man who would love me enough to take me for a mere £50 a year, I should be very well pleased.
Elizabeth would rather face the uncertainty of singlehood than the certainty of a life lived in emotional compromise.
I shall end an old maid and teach your 10 children to embroider cushions and play their instruments very ill.
What makes Elizabeth's resolve so striking is that she never claims it with grand speeches. She simply holds her line. Her principles are private but unwavering. She doesn't throw herself into passionate declarations. She quietly walks away from anything that doesn't align with her sense of self. Her refusal of Mr. Collins is played as humorous in the narrative, but it's also quite tragic. Elizabeth is turning down security, something most women would not have dared do. Her later refusal of Darcy is more emotionally charged, but even more courageous. Here is a man who could change her family's fortune, her social position, and her life. But she says no, because what he offers at that moment is love laced with pride and presumption, and that, for Elizabeth, is no love at all. So in this way, Elizabeth teaches us that strength can be quiet, that revolution doesn't always wear armour. It sometimes wears a bonnet and walks away with its head held high. Darcy has his letter. Elizabeth has her moment of realisation. When she reads his explanation, we see not just a change in opinion, but a shift in identity. The effect of the letter is not immediate. Elizabeth resists questions, turns over the words in her mind, but the seeds are planted. She's forced to reckon with two truths at once, that Darcy may have been misunderstood, and that she, the so-called great judge of character, has been profoundly mistaken.
This, madam, is a faithful narrative of all my dealings with Mr. Wickham, and for its truth I can appeal to the testimony of Colonel Fitzwilliam.
How despicable I have acted. I who have prided myself in discernment. I who have valued myself on my abilities. It's a line of self-reproach that pierces to the core. In one sentence, Austen captures the crushing weight of realisation. Elizabeth isn't humiliated, she's humbled. And that distinction is key. Her pride has been punctured, but her character is not diminished. In fact, it's refined. The visit to Pemberley confirms what she now suspects. Darcy is not who she thought he was. And more importantly, neither is she.
Of all this, I might have been mistress.
She sees him in his home, among his staff, and hears how he is loved and respected. It's a jarring contrast to the haughty man she believed him to be.
And his son will be just like him. The best landlord and the best master.
She witnesses his ease, his generosity, his affection for his sister. There are no declarations, only actions, and Elizabeth watches closely. This journey of reflection transforms her, not instantly and not without lingering pride, but gradually. Elizabeth lets her guard down. She begins to listen more, judge less, and speak with greater consideration. She doesn't abandon her sharpness, but she hones it. Her insight deepens, her wit remains, but now it's paired with wisdom. It's also worth noting that Elizabeth never apologises in a grand gesture. She owns her mistakes through gentleness, through changes in behaviour, and through acts of respect. When she thanks Darcy at the end of the novel, it is without embarrassment or overstatement. It's sincere and it's sufficient.
Mr. Darcy, I can go no longer without thanking you for your kindness to my poor sister.
She doesn't suddenly become quiet or docile, she becomes more perceptive. Her change is not a reversal of personality, but the expansion of character. And in that expansion, Austen gives us one of the most sophisticated portrayals of emotional evolution in literature. Elizabeth's greatest strength was never her wit, it was her willingness to learn. One of the most quietly compelling aspects of Elizabeth Bennet's character is her role not only as a sister and daughter, but as something of a surrogate matriarch within the Bennet household. This was suggested in a comment and a reply, and I'll put them both on screen for a moment. Anne Rogers said, I've been meaning to ask you if you have ever noticed at the church scene where Mrs. Bennet finds out about Netherfield being let. As they move off together from the church door, Lydia gives Mary a little shove in the back, just as someone like Lydia would. I wonder if this was a direction or not. And then Tim McQuiston replied, and it's Lizzie who reprimands her, just as a mother should. It's very intentional direction to show that Lizzie is the boss of the household.
By themselves! Aye, for you're as handsome as any of them, Mr. Bingley might like you best of the party. Lydia.
Much later, she tells her mother that Lydia must be married before she comes back from London.
Because she has been living with Mr. Wickham in London. And if she were to arrive home unmarried still...
Oh, well, I suppose it must be if you put it like that.
I found that intriguing because if you've seen my other videos, you'll know how I've touched on the subject of the dysfunctional parenting from Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. Did they leave the mothering of the younger daughters to the two elder daughters? Though Austen never declares this outright, the text is laced with moments where Elizabeth steps into the emotional and moral void left by her parents, particularly her father's detachment and her mother's preoccupation with social climbing.
I suppose you'll keep Wickham all to yourself again, Lizzie.
Well, of course she will. She is violently in love with him. For heaven's sake, lower your voice.
From the beginning, Elizabeth is portrayed as the most composed of the five daughters. She's neither flirtatious, like Lydia and Kitty, nor socially anxious like Mary. Jane, though gentle and kind, is not confrontational, but Elizabeth, well, she has the sharpness and steadiness of someone who understands that someone must uphold order, however informally. She understands the dynamics of her household better than anyone, often tempering her mother's excesses and prompting her father to act when he would rather remain amused or aloof.
Excuse me, I must speak plainly. If you do not take the trouble to check her, she will soon be beyond the reach of amendment.
In these moments, she is effectively the only adult in the room. And in yet another key moment, it's Elizabeth who ensures that Lydia cannot return home unmarried. Though it was Darcy who intervenes and arranges the hasty marriage, it is Elizabeth who recognises what is at stake. She agrees with the Gardiners and sees the moral boundary that cannot be crossed. These are decisions of someone who has learned, perhaps too early, that if no one else will manage the family's dignity, she must. So it's Elizabeth who keeps the order among the chaos. This undercurrent of responsibility also explains why Elizabeth is so exhausted by silliness and artifice, why she cannot abide Mr. Collins, why she finds Lady Catherine insufferable, and why she is so alert to any hint of duplicity. She's been carrying the burden of discernment for years. And it also explains her standard for love. She doesn't want a man who will merely entertain her or protect her or flatter her. She wants an equal, someone who sees the weight she carries and says, you don't have to carry it alone. That is what Darcy ultimately becomes, not just a romantic hero, but a companion strong enough to share the burden. So Elizabeth's role as the surrogate matriarch is not glamorous. It's subtle. It's in the way she watches, the way she holds the line, the way she shoulders what others won't. And in that quiet, steadfast strength, Austen gives us one of the most compelling portraits of female maturity in literature. Elizabeth lives within the rules of Regency marriage market, a world where inheritance laws, social standing and reputation determine a woman's fate. Her family's fortune is uncertain, her estate is entailed away, her mother is in a perpetual state of matchmaking panic, and her options, we are told again and again, are limited.
You should consider that it is by no means certain that another offer of marriage may ever be made to you.
And yet, Elizabeth doesn't compromise. She doesn't feign affection, and nor does she play coy. When Mr. Collins proposes, offering her a secure future and a socially acceptable match, she refuses without hesitation. When Lady Catherine demands her submission, seeking to preserve a dynastic alliance, Elizabeth stands her ground. Her resistance isn't loud, but it is immovable. She insists on dignity, and in doing so, she becomes not just a character, but a new literary ideal, a woman who chooses not to conform. Her courage lies not in rebellion, but in restraint. She doesn't flee her world. She remains in it, reshaping it with her quiet defiance. She doesn't protest the rules, but she outsmarts them. And in doing so, Austen shows us that resistance can be subtle, and that true strength often speaks in whispers, not shouts. Elizabeth's power lies in the fact that she never pretends, so she is authentic in a world of performance. She never flatters Darcy, never fawns over wealth, and never bends to aristocratic pressure. And yet, she also learns not to be cynical. By the end of the novel, her idealism is matured. It's no longer blind, it's earned. So was Elizabeth Bennet simply a character? Or was she something more? A voice Austen longed to use, a future she could never have, or a celebration of the kind of woman Austen admired most? Elizabeth's independence, her clarity of mind, and her refusal to marry for convenience mirror the choices Austen herself made. Like Elizabeth, Austen valued wit, insight, and emotional honesty. Like Elizabeth, she rejected a marriage that did not align with her values. But where Austen's story ended in spinsterhood, Elizabeth's ends in love. It's tempting, perhaps also inevitable, to see Elizabeth as Austen's avatar in fiction, the woman who lives out the author's principles and is rewarded not with isolation, but with respect and affection. Austen may have written Elizabeth as a reflection of the best version of herself, spirited, thoughtful, unwilling to settle, and ultimately rewarded her for patience and principles. Unlike Austen's own fate, Elizabeth's story ends with love and respect, not compromise or loss. In this way, Austen gifts herself and us a vision of what might have been. And perhaps that is what makes Elizabeth endure. She isn't just a heroine of her time, she transcends it. She doesn't chase love, she becomes worthy of it. She doesn't demand respect, she commands it. And in writing her, Austen offers the world not only a character, but a quiet revolution. Not with speeches, not with grand gestures, but with clarity and wit, and with unshakable resolve to live and love on her own terms. And so we come to the end of Elizabeth's journey, the end of this entire series on characters of Pride and Prejudice, from Darcy's guarded soul to the ridiculous charm of Mr. Collins, from Charlotte's quiet pragmatism to Lydia's heedless flirtations. We've explored the full contrast, choices and consequences of the characters. But Elizabeth is where it all meets up. She's the spark in the stillness, the woman who learns to listen as sharply as she speaks, a heroine who teaches us that wit is wonderful, but wisdom is earned. So I hope this video has offered you something new to think about. Whether you're a lifelong reader of Austen, or you've just discovered what all the fuss is about, and I truly want to thank all of you who have come along on this journey with me, your comments, your theories, your moments of, oh, I never thought of it like that. They've made this channel feel like a proper little salon of Austen appreciation. So before I end, I thought I'd like to say a special thank you to everyone who voted in the poll to help decide the next Jane Austen book we'll be tackling. So the votes are in. Northanger Abbey received 6%. Emma came in at 19%. Close tie here. Persuasion at 36%. And we'll settle on the journey of Sense and Sensibility with 39%. So the character analysis will continue, this time in the company of the Dashwood sisters, genteel poverty, and a certain colonel with a quiet heart. So whether you're here for the analysis, the BBC 95 references, or just the joy of diving into great storytelling, thank you for being here. And don't worry, while this may be the final video in the Pride and Prejudice character arc series, it's certainly not the end of our literary adventures together. So until next time, stay thoughtful, stay curious, and if you ever find yourself as a ball with a brooding gentleman looking at you from across the room, mostly the ladies, just remember, he might not be proud, just poorly socialized.